I want to share a story about Steve Jobs that I have never told anybody. Haven't I told it? Because Steve said he'd fire me if I did. That's not quite right. He said if I told, he'd fire everybody. Two things happened in the world of Steve Jobs this weekend. Steve Jobs, the movie, that is. The Danny Boyle, Aaron Sorkin film opened on nearly 3,000 screens, up from 60 last week, and just 4 the week before that. And, well, it's not the iPhone of movies, is it? I don't even think it's the Apple Watch of movies. I hope that's not because of my review, which you can find here. I don't want to rehash the movie. I am only mentioning it today as a framework for the story I want to tell. This story takes place about 9 years after the movie's Act 2, when Steve introduced the NeXT computer, and 9 months before Act 3, when he introduced the iMac. That's the first product released after his return to Apple. Rewind. As some of you know, I used to work at Apple. My time there as an employee happened during Steve's exile, the interregnum, while he was off doing NeXT and Pixar. But I knew Steve and worked with him as a consultant for 7 years before he left Apple, and then very briefly after his return. It's that last bit that I want to tell you about today. It's May 1997. In the timeline of the movie, that would put it about a year before Act 3, a year before the iMac. Here's how things stood at Apple at the time. Apple has acquired Steve's company, NeXT Incorporated, but Steve has no official role at Apple except as an advisor to CEO Gil Amelio, whom he regards as a bozo. He thought so little of Gil that it's reported he took to ranking people's stupidity in units of gills. Spring 1997. Things are not going well for Gil, or Apple's developers, or shareholders. It's easy to forget that now because Apple is so dominant in the market, but those days, back then, the company was circling the drain. There was, however, a glimmer of hope. Apple had by this time pretty well absorbed the engineering and leadership teams from NeXT, and they were hard at work at the task of adapting the Next Step software to become what we now know as OS X, or for those who don't read Roman numerals, OS X. But it's really 10. Provided that Apple can survive long enough to ship it, which is an open question. Rattling things even more that June, some anonymous shareholder suddenly goes and sells 1.5 million shares of Apple stock all at once. Suspiciously, that happens to be the exact number of shares that Steve Jobs got for selling NeXT to Apple. Well, it later came out that yes, the mysterious seller was Steve. He kept a single share, but he was, it seems, sending a signal of no confidence to Apple's board of directors, and that signal was received. More on that in a bit. I'm in the picture because I was hired to work with Gil Amelio on his upcoming Keynote at Macworld Boston. That's coming up in August. Considering the unmitigated, excruciating disaster of our previous collaboration, Macworld San Francisco, in January, I'm astonished that Gil even gave me the gig. But he did. I had a meeting with Gil and folks from Apple PR and the person engaged to produce the Keynote. We talked about what the Keynote would cover. There wasn't much news to announce. It was going to be another tap dance. And then I went off to prepare a detailed outline. It's now early July. I head back into Apple to meet with Gil to review my outline. I check in at reception. And I'm told my meeting with Gil has been canceled, but I'm not told why. A few days later, I get a call to come in for another meeting at Apple. And I'm not told with whom. Just given a date, a time, and a location. It turns out to be a small conference room. Nearly every seat at the table is taken. I recognize some as members of Apple's events and PR teams. And there was the producer who was going to do the Keynote. And some people I'd never seen before. Well, after we're all assembled and settled, the door opens and in walks Steve Jobs. He's energized, focused, earnest. He thanks us for coming in on a Saturday, and he says, Gil Amelio will not be giving the Keynote at Macworld Boston because I will. Gil is out. So is Steve the new CEO? Apparently not. He's just still an advisor. There was no CEO at this point. But it's clear that Steve is taking charge, whatever his official position or lack thereof. He was the guy. Steve wants to brief us on what he plans to announce at Macworld so the team around the table can go produce the event. But first, he wants to know who's in the room. So one by one, going around the table, we introduce ourselves and explain why we're here. After each person speaks, Steve makes an instant binary decision. You can stay or you can go. One of the first to speak is the meeting producer. He lists as a credential that he had produced the general sessions for the Worldwide Developers Conference, WWDC, in May. Steve says, I think that was shit. You don't need to be here. Oh, that's what it's going to be like? Okay. And so it goes around the table. You can stay, you go. Stay, go. And in my head, I am hearing the clash. Should I stay or should I go? When it came their turn, I learned the folks I didn't recognize were Steve's executive assistant from Pixar and also another meeting producer, one that Steve was more comfortable with from working at Next. So they stay, obviously, there with Steve. I'm one of the last to speak, and I'm not sure whether Steve even remembers and recognizes me or not. It's been 12 years. He is very poker-faced. I tell him I was writing Gil Emilio's speech. I know that's not going to go down well, so I quickly add, I also make videos. But I think he knew that. Steve says, I write my own speeches. I don't need a speechwriter. Okay, getting ready to go. But I do need a video, so stay. He smiles. So I guess he did remember, because he didn't ask me for a reel. He just said, go do it. Before he begins briefing us, Steve has a warning spoken softly, slowly, with a very stern face. He says, if any word of what I'm about to say leaks from this meeting, I will fire everyone in the room. Look around the table. I will fire every one of you. And everyone in the room believes him. And I find that odd. I find that very odd, because as far as I know, nobody in the room, nobody actually works for Steve except for the guy from Pixar. He works for Steve. So how's he going to fire us? As far as anyone knew, Steve wasn't an Apple employee, much less a manager, much less an executive, much less the chief executive. He was an advisor. Advisors don't fire people, do they? But he said with total Steveness that he would fire us all, and we believed him. Nothing leaked. Steve could do that. He didn't need psychic paper. Steve Jobs was psychic paper. So here's what Steve tells us. Apple has been fooling itself and not recognizing its own position in the market. Apple doesn't understand how the outside world perceives it. Apple is too caught up in its own hype. In the business world, he says, it's clear that Windows has won. We need to face that. Mac can't compete. It only has a minuscule market share, except in two areas, creative production and education. Apple dominates in those areas. Steve says he discovered that Apple is the largest education company in the world. We need to focus on those areas. As he expanded on his analysis of Apple's strategic strengths and weaknesses, I had a tremendous feeling of relief on Apple's behalf. We had been through a string of executives whose understanding of Apple was on the order of, we need to be more like Nordstrom, the department store, or we need to be more like Maglite, the flashlight. Seriously, those are the pep talks our executives would give, a department store and a flashlight. Finally, someone showed up who thought that we needed to be more like Apple. It was clear, despite selling his stock, that Steve was still heavily invested in Apple emotionally. Here's what he planned to announce. He didn't see why Apple winning meant that Microsoft had to lose. So instead of trying to oppose Microsoft across the board, Steve said he just picked up the phone and cut a deal with Bill Gates. Key points: end the patent lawsuits between the two companies, cross-license all intellectual property for 5 years. Microsoft commits to continuing to develop Office for Mac for 5 years. It's 18 years later, they're still doing it, and also for iOS now. And finally, Microsoft agrees to make a $150 million cash investment in Apple. That was a big deal, all three parts, huge deal, game changer. And Steve wants to preserve the shock value of announcing it first from the stage at Macworld. So another warning about leaks. Also, Steve knows this. If he offers the behind-the-scenes story of the Microsoft deal to just one publication as an exclusive, he can trade that access for a cover. Steve knew how to get covers. Finally, he says he's going to announce a major restructuring of the board of directors, and he wants the new board members to introduce themselves on video at Macworld. That's what he needed from me, that video. So here's what was going on behind the scenes in the previous 2 or 3 weeks. One Apple board member, Edgar Woolard, former CEO of DuPont, had completely lost confidence in Gil Emilio. He phoned the other members of the board saying he believed that if Emilio stayed as CEO, there was an 80% chance of Apple failing. If they fired Gil, found a different CEO, maybe they could get that down to a 60% chance. But the best option, according to Woolard, was to fire Gil and convince Steve to take charge. But even that was no guarantee of success. The board agreed to fire Gil and authorized Woolard to call Steve. Steve said he'd consider it. Steve later told an Apple employee meeting, when I was trying to decide, I struggled. I talked to a lot of people, got a lot of opinions. And then there I was, late one night, struggling with this, and I called up a friend of mine at 2 a.m. I said, should I come back? Should I not? And the friend replied, Steve, I don't give a fuck about Apple. Just make up your mind, and hung up. And it was at that moment, says Steve, that I realized I truly cared about Apple. Turns out the friend was Andy Grove, one of the giants of Silicon Valley, a co-founder of Intel. Steve got back to Woolard with a yes on 2 conditions. He would not take the title of CEO, but he would run things as an advisor. Second, he wanted Woolard to fire everyone on the board and replace them with people that Steve trusted. Well, in the end, Woolard and Steve agreed to keep 2 board members, Woolard himself and Gareth Chang. Everyone else was new. We're used to Steve's keynotes being about new products, but for Macworld Boston, August 1997, there was no new product. There wasn't even any new advertising to show. He had the new ad theme, Think Different, but the ad wasn't ready. The mission of the keynote, though, was simple but daunting: to give hope, to persuade customers, developers, the press, investors that Apple could come back. His argument had 3 proof points. Steve himself, with his strategy, would be the biggest proof point, of course. And then having Bill Gates appear on video to announce the Microsoft deal would be the second. And the third was going to be the new board of directors. Steve wanted the Apple family to have confidence in their confidence in Apple. So I set off across the country with cinematographer Bill Zarchi and his crew. We interviewed everyone in their offices or homes, carried our own backdrop with us to unify the look. At the time, Apple had a well-equipped internal video production studio, soundstage, editing suites. Jay Tannenbaum was in charge. That's where we did the edit. And I remember the night Steve drove down to look at our rough cut. A little nervous, always a little nervous presenting to Steve. I'll admit that. It was a little nervous, but he liked it. Not only did Steve like it, but the Boston audience liked it too. The laugh lines got laugh, the applause lines got applause. Looking at it today, frankly, it's a pretty dull video. Bunch of business guys in suits talking business, but that was by design. This was not an occasion for magic and dazzle. It was a sober time. It called for a sober approach, and the video did its job. I'm very grateful I could play even that tiny role in Steve's return to Apple. I'm glad I can contribute my small bit to saving the company. Until next time, I'm Mickeleh. DVD extras. Here are just a few things I remember about that night that Steve drove down to Apple TV to review the rough cut. When we got the call that Steve was on the way, Jay Tannenbaum's first action was to warn everybody to remove all traces of the McDonald's takeout food we had just eaten. Get rid of it, he said, before King Vegan gets here. When Steve saw the striped Apple logo at the end title card, he said, "That looks so 1970s. We're going to need to change that soon." And he did. While he was there, he looked around at the multiple $100,000 editing suite, something that didn't exist at the time he left Apple. He took it all in and he said, one day you'll be able to do all this on a Mac. And you can. Flashback. It's the previous summer. I'm at a party with mainly former Apple managers, executives, vice presidents, directors, senior managers. At one point, somebody asks, if you were in charge, how would you save Apple? Nobody in the room had an answer. Of course, now the answer is obvious. Bring back Steve Jobs. Gil Amelio was hired to save Apple, and in a way he did. He brought back Steve Jobs, although I don't think that was his plan. It was Edgar Woolard who actually saved Apple by moving Gil out of the way and putting Steve in charge. Want more? Here's some other videos you might enjoy. Here, that dull board of directors video I just talked about. And that's Steve's full Macworld keynote. Here's my account of how Gil Amelio delivered the worst keynote in Apple history. Here's my review of the Steve Jobs movie. Oh, and to borrow a phrase from Steve, one more thing. It's an interview with Edgar Woolard describing how he brought back Steve. It's on Vimeo, so I can't put it up here on the screen, but if you want to see it, the link is in the description. Bye now.